So let's talk a little bit about other D&D advice, which I am very excited to
Yes.
talk with you about. You now have been running games online for 5 years, 6 years?
6 years online, yeah, 5, 6 years, I think. Because High Rollers has been going 6 years, I want to say. There's some people in chat, they'll correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, I want to say 6 years for High Rollers. Um, and yeah, long time. We've been
And a
going a
great deal
long
of
time.
D&D, of course, before that time.
Mm,
But
yeah,
I specifically bring it up because in a lot of that time, you have spent a lot of time making sort of content design to help people get into D&D, content design to help people learn DMing skills. Um,
mm,
and I'm curious, you even have spoken with this channel before about DM tips.
I have. I have.
What, if anything, has changed about the advice that you would give to someone who is looking for their basic DM
Mm.
tips in 2022?
I don't it's frustrating. I don't think my advice would change much. My advice has kind of stayed pretty steady for people that want to do it. I would reiterate that one big thing which I think is very easy to forget is when you're watching these stream D&D shows or you're listening to podcasts, um it's very and you're a new DM, it's very easy to be intimidated, be like, oh well, like I tried to run a game and it didn't go very well, or it wasn't as good as say, Amy makes it, or Matt Mercer makes it, or Abria makes it, or Mark makes it. You got to remember that we've been GMing a long old time. Like I know me and Matt have been doing it for like half of our lives, which is a considerable number of years. So like don't like you need to remember that like to get good at anything, you have to put the time in. And unfortunately, that just means running games to be a GM. Like you can sit there and watch all the advice videos, you can read all the advice articles, and they'll help. They'll give you a boost step that we never got when we were growing up. But it's not going to help you get better, really. What's going to help you get better is taking those tips and putting them into practice by running games. And that's the best way
Hmm.
you can get and become a better GM is running games and listening to your players. And like that advice for me has never changed. Like those are the two biggest things. You want to become a better GM, run games, listen to your players, and over time, you will do that. You will become a better GM. You will develop a style that suits you, that suits the players you play with. And then you're on the exact same footing as the rest of us. And I don't think that that's changed. I think one thing that might be a little bit different now is streaming games, like streaming D&D games and doing podcasts is a lot more common than when I first started and I was first getting advice on how to start playing D&D. And I think one thing I would say is I do see it quite frequently. People come in, they want to start playing D&D and they immediately want to stream or record or podcast their games. And I think that one thing I would say now that I didn't know to say back then is like maybe don't. Maybe just play for yourself, get a campaign under your belt and just enjoy it with your friends. Don't worry about putting a stream or a podcast out there. Even if you like, oh, but I'm so excited, it's really compelling, I want to do it. I would say hold off just for now because streaming your game, no matter what you do, no matter who you are, with High Rollers, with my show, we really try and put an emphasis on making it feel like a home game that the cameras are on. And, it's not performative, not a show or anything like that. But even then, we still feel the pressures and the stresses of knowing people are watching the game. And that does add another level to it. Whereas when you can just sit back with your buds and you can make jokes and you can muck about and you can take breaks and you can do all this kind of stuff, it helps massively to just learn the game, get a feel for it, and just enjoy it as well. So I think that that's maybe one thing I would say differently to today than I would back then. Because back then it just wasn't as common. Like we were one of the few shows doing Twitch and doing podcasts, D&D stuff back then. So yeah.
That's a very fascinating point, especially because, to your point earlier, I have a few years of DMing under my belt, but I was a player for literal decades before that
Mm,
happened. And
mm,
so I come from a place where I'm rooted in play experiences that were sort of inherently the very small theater that is you and your five friends.
mhm.
And I know a lot of folks now who've done a lot of their first play experiences in public context, and they've taken to it like a duck to water, and they have wonderful
Yeah,
players. But it is
amazing,
an
yeah.
interesting for me. It's tough to imagine coming in sharing your first efforts, having
Oh
that
my god.
extra audience member at the table. That's I certainly would say, like, if you get a chance, just do some at home. Then you don't have to. If you take a long break, it's fine.
Yeah,
If you all stop and
exactly.
get distracted by something and look something up, that's totally okay. Not that you can't pause
Exactly.
on stream, but you won't be able to help a certain sense of like, oh, we do want to keep it
Urgency.
moving. You know, that's
Exactly. Yeah.
mm.
Yeah, and also, these when you're first playing those first campaigns, you know, with all the best intentions of everybody at that table, problems can come up. Like people can have disagreements. People might do things that aren't acceptable at the table, even if they're not bad people. They might just not think. You don't want to have that recorded and broadcasted to everybody because you can probably sit there and figure it out as friends. But we live in this culture where like we there's so much pressure for us to share everything online and to make everything like a thing that we like to create content about what we're doing. And actually, that's a scary thing, right? That's like you are putting yourself and sharing your most vulnerable parts online. Just take a moment, just sit back, enjoy the game for what it is. Because that's like for me, I think back to like playing with my friends. There's no way on earth I would have ever let us stream those games because we were like 16, 17, 18-year-old boys all hanging out playing D&D, and we would be silly and we would muck about, and I'm just like, god, nobody needs to see the dumb jokes that we were making to each other and stuff like that. Nobody needs to see my awkward first attempts at like playing a female character and stuff like that. Like nobody needs to see that stuff, and things like that. So I think that just take that moment to enjoy it for yourself, and then come to it and be like, was that something you really enjoyed doing? Do you feel like you've got something that you want to share? And then maybe stepping into sort of the more streaming podcasting side of things.
And
Yeah,
I
I
will
think.
say it as fun as it is to imagine having a time machine to those teen games. I certainly like the games we played when I was a teen were like a lot of I like to emphasize that pretty much anyone can hop into D&D and have a good time pretty quickly,
Mm.
but it doesn't mean that it won't you can't it is normal to encounter, especially early on, some situations of like, oh, actually, some of the players are getting frustrated. Oh, somebody kind of hurt somebody else's feelings. Those are normal
Oh
parts of
yeah,
games. And you
yeah,
deserve to get to sort of figure that stuff out with your friends and not
yep.
necessarily, I don't know, we're not on an anti streaming crusade, but just like, it's
No, no, no,
okay to have
absolutely
that
not.
be for
Yeah,
you and your friends. Mhm.
that's it. I
Yeah.
think it's absolutely not. Yeah, exactly that. I don't want to seem like I'm kind of saying don't ever stream your D&D games. Absolutely not. I literally do it as a living, and it's the best thing I've ever done. It's more that just like I see a lot of groups, they just jump into streaming their D&D game right away, and it's just like I would just say like, hey, if you want to do that, absolutely fine. You can go ahead. My advice to you, being in the scene and knowing a lot about it and being around for a long time, maybe don't play it, just enjoy it for you and your friends for this first campaign, and then take a look at it for the next one. That's just my advice. You can listen to it or not. So yeah.
So, speaking of running those campaigns, whether they are home
Mm,
games, stream games, or something else, one thing I'd love to hear about is running a long term campaign, something that lasts
mm.
multiple years. That is an extra skill set on top of DMing. What have you learned, or
Yeah.
what would be your advice for folks who really want to be in it for the long haul and make something that matters?
Yeah. So we've been doing our main campaign for High Rollers, Erois. That's been going 3 years now. And I didn't think it would go this long. I think that pandemic and a few other things have kind of mixed things up a little bit and made it a little bit longer than we were expecting. The best advice I can give for that as a DM is to one thing that I've kind of really taken on board and I think really helps with DM burnout, because that's very likely to happen with a long term campaign. Especially like me, I have ADHD. I get bored of ideas very quickly. So sticking with the same thing for a very long time is quite hard for me. And you see it all the time with other DMs. Like people start campaigns, it fizzles out after a few months. The DM wants to start a new campaign or make new characters and yada yada yada. I think one of the best things you can do is, and this is just a general DM advice as well, bring in the stuff you love. Like if you play a certain video game and you love that video and you're like really enjoying it and you're having a good time, and you want to bring in some cool element of that video game into your D&D campaign, do it. There's going to be a lot of people that like, oh, don't copy stuff, or like, oh, but blah blah blah. If it helps you keep that level of interest and that level of fun up because you're involved, you're taking something that you love and putting it in, 100% do it. Like that's how I've kept our campaign going for a long time. Erois is a very sci-fi fantasy magitech kind of mixed campaign. And as the longer it's gone on, the more things that I've brought in to keep my interest high. So it started off very traditional with fantasy. it then moved into sort of more exploring sort of the more technological aspects to being a full-blown like, right, they are now in astral space and there's mechs and there's anime swords and things like that, where I'm just like putting all the things I love, Star Wars and everything else. It just became, but it's been great because it's kept my interest fresh, it's kept my excitement high, which then goes to the players. Like when I'm having a good time and I'm excited about something, it feeds into them and they feed off of that and they're like, oh, that's so cool, and they build on it as well. Even if they're not a fan of the thing that I've totally copied and ripped off, they'll just be like, they can see how excited I am for it and they get caught up in it. So I think that that's something I would do, is like, don't be afraid to just bring in something to keep it fresh and fun for you as the GM, because it is very easy to get burnt out, especially for a long running campaign.